Hello and welcome to our IHA members webinar on climate resilience and adaptation in the hydropower sector. My name is Alex Trembath. I work in the communications team here at IHA and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. We've got a range of speakers for you today. You will have probably seen the details on our webinar page before you signed up, but I will introduce them to you one at a time. We also want to make today's webinar interactive and we'd like you to participate. You can use the chat pane which you should see in your interface for the webinar. If you can use the chat to submit questions to us while the panelists are speaking, then I will submit the questions to the panelists once they've spoken. We'll do our very best to fit in as many questions as possible. It might be that we won't be able to get through all of them, but we will try. We are recording today's webinar. We will be making a recording available to IHA members after the webinar. So if you have any colleagues who couldn't make it today, or if there's anyone else you'd like to share it with, we'll be sharing that link with you afterwards. So IHA and the World Bank Group recently convened a workshop on the resilience of hydropower and dams to climate change, bringing together 28 participants representing the hydropower sector, as well as multilateral organisations such as the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that's EBRD. A summary of this workshop and soft copies of the presentations we're currently working on and we'll be publishing in the next week or two and sharing that with you as well. So keep an eye out for that. As part of this initiative, at IHA, we carried out a survey of more than 50 organisations involved in hydropower development. What we were trying to achieve through this survey is to establish an understanding of how climate change is affecting the hydropower sector and the measures that are being taken to build climate resilience into hydropower projects. And part of this webinar today is that we're going to be presenting the results of the survey, as well as the outcomes of the workshop that I mentioned. Without further hesitation, let me introduce our first speaker. So Pravin Karki is with us today. He is the Senior Hydropower Specialist at the World Bank Group. Pravin has got over 20 years of professional experience relating to hydropower and water resources, mainly in hydropower engineering, international policy and academic research. Pravin joined the World Bank in 2008 and is currently in the energy and extractives global practice working on hydropower projects, mainly in Asia. He currently leads the World Bank's work on resilience in the hydropower and dam sector. So let's turn to Pravin, who will speak about the World Bank's approach, and he'll give a further introduction to today's webinar. So I'm going to bring Pravin online now and I'm going to share his slides with you. So over to you, Pravin. Welcome.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, everybody. This is Pravin from Washington, D.C. A very good welcome to you. Good morning to you. And I'd like to start my presentation, which I gave in London recently at the meeting that Alex was alluding to. So basically, I'd like to talk about building resilience for climate change and natural disaster risks in hydropower and dams, and the work at the World Bank Group, which is the World Bank, IFC, and MEGA. Just checking if everybody can hear me. Alex?
Yes, we can. Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can't see anyone. Any.
All right. So next, please. Next slide. Thank you. So I'd just like to start with the World Bank Group's re-engagement in the hydropower sector and where we stand in terms of our global engagement. Next, please. So as you can see from this slide, 102 projects supporting development of new or rehab of some 473 dams. Mainly they are primarily rehab, but we also have projects in the hydropower sector. Mainly the leading ones are in the irrigation, followed by hydropower. Next one, please. So where are we active? Mainly in the Asian region, East Asia, South Asia, and Africa region. Next, please. So let me talk about the climate change and screening requirements in World Bank operations. Next, please. So there is a requirement in the World Bank now that all new operations, lending operations, will be screened for short and long-term climate change and disaster risks, and where risks exist, integrate appropriate resilience measures. Next, please. So in 2010, I'm just going to give you a kind of historical perspective on where we are coming today. In 2010, the independent evaluation group of the World Bank came out with a report called Adapting to Climate Change, Assessing the World Bank Group Experience. And the report said that although hydropower had a long tradition of dealing with climate variability, the bank group lacked guidance on appropriate methods for incorporating climate change considerations into project design and appraisal. And at that time, I was asked to look into, because we were preparing quite a big pipeline of hydropower projects globally, I was asked to look at how climate screening was being done at the bank, and also come up with some guidelines. Next, please. So this actually coincided with some of our clients also expressing the need for monitoring and research and a move to more flexible and iterative planning. So for example, in 2014, the Nepalese government did a study and a report called Economic Impact Assessment of Climate Change in Key Sectors in Nepal, stressed the need to really understand the climate change impacts for the country in the hydropower sector. Next, please. So what we did was actually we went to the Nepalese authorities, and through Nepal Hydropower Association did a quick survey to really understand if they were familiar with methodologies of studying climate change impacts, and 70% said no. And that was a bit worrying for a country that is so heavily dependent on hydropower, that the climate change impacts were not really being looked into. Next, please. So what we did is we started looking at the climate change analysis and how it was being performed. And like I said, there was no really guidance. Each project was doing its own thing. But there were various initiatives within the climate change office, which was dealing with decision making under uncertainty, about which you will hear in a moment. The water GP was doing decision tree. Most of this was focused on screening tools, and I must admit today we have a pretty good understanding of how the screening is done, but there is very little on resilience. So there is really a need to develop these guidelines, and that's why we're here today, to really talk about what is needed in order to document, measure, and implement the resilience within the hydropower sector. For example, a couple of things I'd like to share with you. We realize now that resilience is really a bridge between upstream climate screening, climate change science, and downstream with the practical engineering world. So the World Bank, what we did at the World Bank was we really, in the months of October and November, we were on a scoping mission going globally to different parts of the world and meeting international professional organizations, including ICOLD, IHA, to understand through their members if there was an understanding of resilience and what was needed to move forward. And we're very pleased that IHA will be sharing results from the survey. It clearly indicates that there is absolutely a need to develop some sort of guidance on resilience. Next, please. So just to give you some kind of summary of the work we've been doing here, it's true there is no accepted general methodology for assessing the significance of climate risks, and there is no accepted process within the World Bank. But we are kind of we have identified the main methodologies. So there is a plethora of documents and methods available to use, and there is really a need for a pragmatic process for risk assessment. Not just at the bank, but with different clients all over the world that are really keen on developing sustainable hydropower. And my colleague hopefully will talk in a moment about the new approach of robustness-based bottom-up alternative to previous top-down approaches to climate risk assessment, which so-called beyond global circulation models. Next, please. This report called Investment Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty can be actually downloaded if you search on the internet. But the interesting conclusion was that it was not possible to define the best solution or to prescribe to any particular method. So like I said, instead there were a menu of methodologies, and it's really it depends on which strategy you adopt. Next, please. So in about 3 years ago, the government of Nepal asked the World Bank for financing of the Upper Arun project, and because this requirement for screening climate change and natural disasters had already come, we applied the decision tree method in the case of Upper Arun. And the issue there was a project in a basin, the Upper Arun project in Upper Arun Basin. In isolation, we studied the impacts, but what we quickly understood was it could not be done in isolation, had to be done within the basin cumulatively. So we started the initiative to look at the resilience at the project level within an integrated river basin management concept and the master plan generation. So after the earthquake in Nepal in 2015, we quickly realized that resilience is just beyond hydrology alone. It's also to do with earthquake and other natural disasters. And if you talk about the system level resilience, the fuel crisis of 2015 clearly demonstrated that the resilience was more than just climate change. Okay, next, please. Okay, can we go to the next one? So here's my last slide, and I'd like to end on this note. At the World Bank, we have, for example, secured nearly $6 billion in 2014 the funding that contributed to climate and disaster resilience. So there's a lot of work going in resilience, and what we really need to develop is a monitoring and evaluation framework and corresponding measurement approaches for such resilience building operations which are lacking. So hopefully through the IHA membership, through feedback, we will be able to conclude this work. At the end of this year, we would like to initiate a process where we would hire an international firm to help us develop specific guidelines in the hydropower sector. And we will be sharing the terms of reference consulting widely to understand and make sure that all the important aspects are covered. With that, I'd like to end my presentation. Thank you very much. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Pravin. It's very good to hear what the World Bank is doing in this area. At the moment, there aren't any questions, so we're going to move on, and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions to all panelists at the end, depending on time, hopefully, but do feel free to continue using the chat box to submit questions if you would like to. I'm going to move on to our next panelist now. I mentioned earlier that we've conducted a survey of more than 50 organisations on the topic of climate change, and we'll now hear from my colleague at IHA, Tracy Lane, who is going to present the results of the survey. Tracy is the director of our hydropower development work programme here at IHA. I'm just moving the slides on a moment. Just bear with me a second. Yes, so yeah, Tracy directs our hydropower development work programme, and in this role she leads our initiatives relating to the building and sharing of knowledge in the areas of energy systems, climate change, risk and finance, regional cooperation and water resources management. So I'm going to pass over to Tracy, who is going to talk us through the results of the survey. Just one second. Over to Tracy.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I hope that everyone's able to see the presentation on the screen. I'll go ahead and get started. As Alex mentioned, we carried out a survey to determine how climate change is affecting the hydropower sector and what measures are being taken to build climate resilience into hydropower projects. With the assistance of Mott MacDonald, one of our IHA members, we developed a survey of 26 questions, which was sent out during a 3-week period in late October, early November. We received back 51 responses from 51 separate organizations, and the results from those respondents is what I'll present to you today. So the first few questions, I'm starting with question 3. The first few were getting to know you type questions, so I won't spend too much time on those. Question 3, what is the core business of your organization? As you can see here, the majority of respondents were owner-operators, followed by consulting companies. Respondents were well distributed among IHA's 6 regions, which I think is a pretty good indication then of how this issue is being viewed globally. Question number 5, what is your job role? We had a good mix of respondents with different job responsibilities, and from CEO and director, vice president level to climate specialist and sustainability, and from the business side as well. So again, a good mix of responses. So our first substantive question, we wanted to, there are several definitions floating around for climate resilience, but we wanted to test these with the hydropower sector with a view to settling on a common definition for the sector. This, the definition you see on your screen here is what we proposed, and we asked respondents to comment on this definition. So what we proposed is climate resilience can be defined as the capacity of a facility or system to withstand or rapidly recover from the possible impacts of climate change and other external shocks. We did receive quite a few comments on this. Over half of the respondents did comment on this particular definition, and we can group the comments into three themes. Many respondents felt that the word rapidly was not appropriate given the gradual nature of climate change and some of its impacts. As well, the reference to other external shocks at the end of the definition there, many felt that that was too generic and really could include a number of issues entirely unrelated to climate change, and felt that it would be better to exclude that. And then some respondents felt that the word rapidly in the middle there, rapidly recovering from the possible impacts of climate change, was not necessary, that rather it was possible to adapt. Oh, sorry, it was the word recover there. I already mentioned the rapidly bit. It's the recover portion there that people also took issue with. Some people, they felt that it was possible to adapt and respond to a new normal rather than fully recovering to a prior state. So those were that was the main flavor of the comments we received on this definition. So we'll be taking a look at that and perhaps proposing another definition that we'll start using in our own materials, but I think there's probably some room for further discussion on that. Moving on to question 7, when will the main impacts of climate change start to be materially felt by your organization? A majority of respondents, 63%, felt that the main impacts of climate change are already being felt by their organization, with a further 36% stating that impacts will be felt within the next 10 to 30 years, which is, those are timeframes are, in hydropower, timeframes that impact decisions being made today. Question 8. The need to take action to increase resilience to the impacts of climate change is under increasing discussion. Would you say that it's necessary, not necessary to take any steps, necessary to take modest steps over the coming years, necessary to take major steps very soon, or we've already started taking steps at our organization? As you can see, in terms of the number of respondents indicating that they're already taking steps, 22%. I think that was quite an interesting finding, given that 63% indicated in a prior question that the impacts of climate change are already being materially felt by their organization, yet only 22% have already started taking steps. Question 9, has your organization ever carried out a climate change risk assessment? Again, it's interesting to see here that fewer than half of the respondents had definitely carried out a climate change risk assessment, given the high numbers indicating the impacts of climate change are already being materially felt by their organization. Now, on some of the questions, we did ask for further information for people to elaborate where they could on, for example, if they have carried out a risk assessment. We asked for some details of that or some information. We can see from the responses a range of activities indicating varying levels of risk assessment or similar activities. For example, permanent, ongoing, detailed assessments of the climate system, taking into account energy production, environment issues, social issues, and dam safety, onto SWOT analysis, and onto a more limited high-level reviews of potential impacts and preparedness. So a range of detail on the risk assessment. Question 11. What type of information does your organization use in order to predict the future risks associated with climate change? Respondents, as you can see, use a range of information to help predict or assess the future risks. We can see that the media reports and internet research and academic literature are leading in terms of what people are turning to at this stage. But there's still quite a lot of use of regional climate models and analysis of energy system and/or market demand. Question 12, do you have access to government support in any of the following areas? Survey responses indicate available but limited guidance from government entities with regard to climate change information. Government support is mostly limited to assessment and guidelines without much indication of incentives coming from government. So that was an interesting finding. Question 13, does your organization have existing guidelines on climate risk or resilience? So does your organization have a guideline? And again, this highlights that although a majority of respondents felt they were experiencing those material impacts from climate change, very few had or knew about company guidelines on the topic. Question 14, when thinking of your organization, please indicate the level of risk associated with each of these potential impacts of climate change. Now this question was a multiple option answer. People could indicate among these categories listed on the bottom here, they could indicate significant risk, moderate risk, minimum risk, not a risk, or don't know for each of them. So the way to look at this, I think, is to take a look at the amount of red in each category. So if you stack the two shades of red together, that would be a significant risk or a moderate risk for those categories. So the ones with the highest significant and moderate risk combined would be changes to flow variability, extreme weather events, and changes to mean flow. Those were viewed as the largest significant or moderate risk by the most number of respondents. And sea level rise was considered a high risk for the fewest number of respondents. Next question, what are the main areas of impact for a changing climate on your organization? The most respondents felt that operational and financial impacts were the main areas to be concerned with. And operational for this survey was defined as damage to physical assets, failure of assets due to environmental conditions, complete loss of assets, and reduced reliability of power supply. Financial impacts were changes to the market or for your products or services, changes to the customer base, new investment requirements, and competitors' advantage. Question 16, do you see any potential opportunities related to a changing climate for your business? And this again, I felt was quite an interesting response. 70% do see potential opportunities related to climate change. Many of these were grouped into categories relating to providing adaptation services, an upcoming need for more water storage, and therefore hydropower's role in providing that water storage, and then increased flows and therefore increased generation. Question 18, in your opinion, to what degree is expected climate change already influencing your organizations? And the options here, you can see that engineering and structural design received the most responses here in terms of actions being taken. Next question, does your organization have any of the following activities or processes related to climate risks? There were many more no's than yeses on these. The most prevalent activities or processes in place were related to collaborative partnerships with leading climate research institutions or experts, but staff training and greenhouse gas targets also were in place in many organizations. Has your organization considered or is it considering any of the following resilience measures? The results indicate that most respondents are investing in understanding the problem or understanding the risk, which aligns, I think, with the rest of the survey, as this is perhaps an earlier step before taking more concrete or structural measures in response. Next question. In your experience, what has been or do you foresee as the biggest challenge of integrating climate change considerings into the management of your operations? What I thought was quite interesting here is that relatively few survey respondents cited high costs as one of the biggest challenges. Up here you can see cost is too high. I did not receive all that many responses relative to others. A lack of a robust policy framework and climate change risk being low relative to other variables, as well as lack of understanding of the science, were much more prevalent in the responses as challenges to integrating climate change considerations. Which of the following will your organization use to measure the impacts of a changing climate on your business? Leading the way here in terms of responses was loss of production would be the key measure among most of the respondents. What would be needed to make a business case for investing in resilience to climate change? Cost-benefit analysis on investments in resilience was a clear answer for several of the respondents. In the none of the above category, other answers were lender requirements, funding, and appropriate markets for new services. In your investment plans, do you have any of the following? Risk assessment was strongly represented in investment plans. Sensitivity analysis on climate variables also. In the other category here, most of the responses in other were none of the above, actually. Question 25, have you already experienced climate resilience-related scrutiny or requirements from external stakeholders? And what we can see is there is some, but limited external scrutiny. So some insurers, some lenders, some regulatory authorities are asking questions or imposing requirements on this topic, but it's not as widespread as we might have thought. And finally, do you think sector guidelines on climate risk or resilience would be useful? And as we can see, there's an overwhelming response rate here of 83% indicating that guidelines would be useful for the sector. And I think that's important for us to know and take that into our actions going forward collectively. So with that, I'll end my formal presentation. But if anyone would like to ask questions, I think I have a few minutes to take questions.
Thank you, Tracy. So a question for you before we move on to the next speaker. Did you find the survey outcomes to be largely what you expected, or were you surprised by any of the results?
I have to say, I think because we haven't been asking these questions a lot very broadly, I didn't really know what to expect. So I had a kind of a open mind in terms of what we would get. I was a bit surprised to see how many people, how many organizations felt that their organization was already materially being impacted, yet the corresponding actions to do something or to address the climate risk were much lower. So I was a bit surprised by that finding.
Thank you for that response. I've got a question from Jim Neumann, who's asking, did any respondents note the possible opportunity that climate change concerns may provide a comparative market advantage for low greenhouse gas energy sources such as hydropower?
I would have to actually go back and look through the individual responses for that one. I don't recall that particular answer, but I'd have to go back and look. I'm happy to do that and get back to you, though.
Okay, we have another question from Richard St. Jean. Are there existing guidelines for risk assessment of climate change? Should this not be the starting point before guidelines on resilience?
Are there existing guidelines on, what was that?
Risk assessment of climate change.
Well, I think this is what we'll need to look into, is what exactly is out there in terms of guidelines, related guidance, or starts or sectoral guidance, perhaps even from other sectors. We need to do a full review of what is available, and I agree that we would need to know that before we start from scratch. It is certainly better to see what work has already been done and incorporate that as we move forward.
And another question, this will probably need to be the last one before we move forward because we're slightly behind, but I've got a question from Eleni Taylor-Wood, who says, were the responses similar from developed versus developing countries, or were there clear differences?
That's a very good question. I have to say we have not had the opportunity yet to really drill down and compare the responses by region, from one region to another. It's something we'd like to do to the extent that we can before we distribute this information more broadly. But it's a very good question, and we will be trying to pull that information out of the survey results.
Okay, thank you very much, Tracy. We're going to move forward now. So thank you for introducing the survey results. It's certainly a very broad and complex subject, and it's been interesting to hear what's been going on. It seems like there is a strong appetite to build knowledge on this topic and provide further guidance. We would like to thank everyone who's participated in the survey. It's a very important topic for the sector, and it's good to see a deep level of engagement, and we're hoping to move this topic forward. As you may already be aware, IHA is launching a knowledge network on climate change. Now, the purpose of this is we're aiming to foster discussion on the hydropower's role in climate mitigation and adaptation, and provide our members, either individual members or employees of IHA member companies, with access to expertise on topics. And we're setting up this knowledge network on climate change to begin with. If you'd like to find out more about that, there's some information in the membership section of our website, which is www.hydropower.org, and you can also join the Knowledge Network group on LinkedIn. So if you search for IHA Climate Change on LinkedIn, you should find the network. It's quite a small community at the moment because we've just launched, but we're looking to build that and continue the momentum that's been started by the work on this initiative. So thanks again for everyone who's engaging in that. Now I'm going to move forward and introduce the next speaker. So we're going to be joined by Julie Rosenberg, who is an economist with the World Bank. And we're going to find out a little bit more about how we can make good decisions with regards to climate resilience. Julie's work includes green growth and climate change mitigation strategies, climate change adaptation, and disaster risk management. She participated in the writing of 2 major World Bank reports, one on decarbonising development, 3 steps to a zero carbon future, and also shockwaves, managing the impacts of climate change on poverty. So I'm just going to introduce Julie and pass the slides over to her. So if you bear with me one moment. So welcome, Julie.
Thank you. So I'm assuming that now everyone sees my slides. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Rosenberg, and I work for the Chief Economist for Sustainable Development at the World Bank. And one of my main activities is to develop and tailor and mainstream methodologies to support decision-making for long-term infrastructure investments, and in particular to take into account the deep uncertainties that exist on climate change. What's very particular about long-term infrastructure is not just that those are very long-term investments, it's also that those are investments that shape the world around them. So the quote here is a quote from the paper that Praveen was referring to before by Stefan Algat and others on decision-making under deep uncertainty. And what the paper says is that infrastructure can shape development for decades or centuries, a duration that often extends beyond infrastructure's lifetime because the economic system reorganizes itself around them. And the picture here is a picture of the Hoover Dam in the US. When the Hoover Dam was built in the 1930s, there were 200,000 people living in the southwest of the US. today, less than a century later, it's 20 million people who live there and who depend on water storage, flood regulation, and electricity production that's provided by the Hoover Dam. So of course, at the time when the dam was designed and built, people had no idea what California would look like today. And actually, this is a picture that I like. It's a picture of the year 2000 seen from the beginning of the 20th century. And the person who drew that picture thought that we would not really change fashion and we would still have horses, but we would be able to walk on water with big balloons. Really, the point where I'm getting at here is that whenever we build long-term infrastructure, at some point we need to think about what people would want or like 50 years from now, what kind of technologies will be available, and in the case of hydropower, what climate will look like. And the problem with climate, as you all know right now, is that it's changing. And it's changing because we are accumulating greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So one way to look at climate is to use the global circulation models. Those are called the GCMs. They're the big climate models that are used by the IPCC in the various reports that they're publishing. What those models do is that they take as an input the trajectories of greenhouse gases emissions and greenhouse gases concentrations in the atmosphere, and then they simulate the changes in climate resulting from those concentrations over a century or sometime 200, 300 years in the future. And so those models simulate changes in temperature, precipitations, ocean circulations, etc. And they're very useful to have an idea of what the global climate is going to look like. But it's very important to know that if you're using those models, you need to be very careful with the interpretation of the results at the local level. Because actually, those models disagree with each other at the local level, especially on precipitation changes. What you see on that slide, on the left is the French climate model, and on the right is the Australian climate model. And here is the results of two simulations with the exact same scenario for greenhouse gases emissions and concentrations. And what you can see is that one model predicts an increase in precipitation in Western Africa, and the other one predicts a decrease in precipitation in Western Africa. And there's really no way to know if one model is better than the other, or if one model is right and the other one is wrong. Really, there's no objective criteria for that. And so the problem is that there's lots of different models that exist now, and the input of those models, which is the concentration in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, is also uncertain because this is going to depend on the policy choices that are made in the next few decades. And actually some of them will be decided next week in Paris, right? So what, are we doomed to build dams that maybe in 20, 30, 50 years won't be able to produce electricity because there's no water anymore? The answer is no, but it's important to change the way we make decisions. So the traditional way of making decision or long-term planning is to start by asking, what will the future be? So you agree on one projection of future climate, future electricity prices, future demand, and based on that projection, you can make your decision. So you can agree on the best near-term decisions given your scenario. And then in general, you make a few sensitivity analysis to make sure that your system is robust, and you build margins of errors just in case. Well, this kind of plannings work well when conditions are stable or easy to predict, and when there is consensus among stakeholders around what the future will be like and what is the best decision given that particular future. The problem with this kind of planning is that it tends to build overconfidence in your projection of the future, and it also tends to build overconfidence in your choices. And sometimes it leads to catastrophic consequences. So the picture that you see here is a picture from Fukushima in Japan. And Japan is protected against storm surges and against tsunamis by seawalls. And the people who had built the seawalls were sure that no wave could ever be higher than those walls. So they were sure that they were 100% protected against natural disasters. The problem is that one day there was one wave that was higher than the wall. And because they didn't think that that was possible, the wave was actually like 50 centimeters higher than the wall, so not much higher. But still the consequences were catastrophic because they hadn't planned for this to happen. So instead, what we're trying to do at the World Bank is develop those methodologies for decision making under uncertainty, and the idea is that you will run the analysis backwards. Instead of trying to start by projecting the future or agreeing on a vision of the future, you start by defining your objectives and your options available. In general, once you know what you're trying to achieve, there's a limited number of options available. So you list all of your different options, and then you can identify the vulnerabilities of your different strategies by stress testing your strategies against many different possible futures. And once you've identified those vulnerabilities, you know which strategy is more robust than the other, and you also can develop adaptation to reduce those vulnerabilities. And sometimes actually with climate change and hydropower, what you find when you do that is also that you have opportunities to change your design to produce more power. It's not just negative outcomes that climate change can bring. But the idea is that you really need to consider many different possible outcomes. So there are many different methodologies. They all have different names like robust decision making, decision scaling, robust optimization. All of those are a bit different. They're led by different kinds of universities or consultants, but they share really common characteristics. And so I will show you very quickly what those common characteristics are. The first one is that you really need to start your analysis and your decision-making process by carefully defining your metrics of success. Usually for a big infrastructure project, you have many different stakeholders involved. They all have many different objectives, but you need to be aware of what those different objectives are and be able to quantify them, because if you can't quantify success, then it's very difficult to quantify failure and to identify resilience measures to decrease those possibilities for failure. So this may sound a bit simplistic, but it's really important, and I found out after working on a few projects that people tend to forget what their objectives are. The second one is that once you know what your options are, it's very important to think about possibilities rather than predictions. So instead of using one scenario of future climate, for instance, it's very important to think about many different possible scenarios, using possibly all the different models that exist in the IPCC or using different kinds of model more at the local level. And it's also important to think about possibilities not just for climate, but for other variables as well, because electricity prices, electricity demand, and other kinds of socioeconomic variables are also deeply uncertain. The third one is that it's really important to know that we can't wait for new information on climate before we make decisions. There are many countries in the world right now where people don't have basic access to electricity, so we can't wait for better information on climate change before we invest in hydropower. But the idea is also that every time the IPCC releases a new report, the uncertainty tends to increase because there are more and more models, and all those models bring new kinds of scenarios to the picture. But even though you don't have perfect information on what the climate will look like, it's very important to build learning through the investment process. And it's also very important to favor flexible solutions that can be adjusted over time when conditions change. And even if the conditions change in a way you hadn't be able to predict. Finally, and that's very important, in all of those methodologies, one important feature is that all the relevant stakeholders need to be involved in the analysis and in the decision process in all the different steps. So in defining the objectives, in thinking about the different scenarios and conditions for failure, and in choosing, of course, among the different possibilities. So we use those methodologies in different World Bank projects and World Bank sectors. We use them for water management, for flood risk management, for energy resource management, and actually for some other sectors. I'm just going to show you very quickly an example to give you a concrete idea of what those methodologies look like. So this is a framework that was designed by the water sector at the World Bank. That's called the decision tree, and it involves a series of steps to help you identify the climate vulnerabilities of your projects, stress test those projects, and then build in resilience. So the steps are more and more complicated and difficult in terms of analysis. Here I'm going to show you directly the phase 3, which is a climate stress test, and I'm going to show it to you for a hydropower project in Nepal. So this was done by a team at the University of Massachusetts, and what they do is that they have a model that can statistically generate hundreds of possible future climate. So it's coherent combinations of changes in temperature and precipitations, and then they take all those different climate scenarios, they put them into a hydrological model, and then they take those hundreds of possible hydrological conditions and put them into a hydropower model. And then based on that, they can map the vulnerabilities of different hydropower projects. So here, I'm going to show you the stress test of a particular design in Nepal. So what you see on this graph is on the x-axis, changes in precipitations, and on the y-axis, changes in temperature, so increase in temperature. And the color on the graph is an indicator for the performance of your system. So here, whenever the color is not dark blue, or whenever the indicator is lower than 0.95, it means that your system is not performing well. So what you can see here is that the graph is all red, which means that it's not really resilient to changes in climate change, because whenever precipitation decreases by more than 5% or temperature increases by 1 degree, the system does not perform well anymore. So then they implemented a series of measures that you can add to change your design and make it more resilient or more robust. And here is a second stress test on the new design for that particular dam. And you can see that now the system is performing well for a wide range of possible changes in climate, and it's still performing well even if precipitation decreased by 15% and temperature increases by 2 or 3 degrees. So then, of course, there's a cost to all of those different options to increase the resilience of the system. And what they did here is kind of a cost curve for hydropower. So the x-axis is the different options that are available to reduce risk. So this can be quantified, of course. They haven't done it on that slide, but they've just ranked the different options according to their capacity to reduce risk. And the y-axis is the cost of those different measures. So it goes from real-time sediment monitoring on the left, that is very cheap but does not really increase resilience a lot. And then on the right you have enlarged spillways that are very expensive but really bring a lot of additional robustness or resilience to the system. So just a few concluding remarks now, because I think that my time is over. What's very important, I think, is that resilience is context-specific. It depends on your system, on how you define your system, and how you define your objectives. So it's very hard to come up with universal metrics for resilience, because it really, to me, it really depends on what you're trying to achieve and what kind of what kind of failure you're ready to allow for your system. The second is how quickly can we measure resilience. I think that one way of doing so is to stress test the system to as many different futures as possible. Then you will know under which conditions your system fails and under which conditions your system performs well. And I think that what you're trying to achieve is to have as many different futures as possible under which your system performs well. The third one that's very important is that failure and lack of resilience is not necessarily linked to climate alone. Usually in all of the projects I've been working on, it's never just climate change that leads to a failure of the system. It's a combination of climate change with other changes like increases in demand that were not foreseen or changes in prices. And actually sometimes climate change is really not the main risk. For instance, I've been working on a project on Lima water supply, and Lima is very worried because they depend on glaciers and precipitations tend to decrease because of climate change. And actually what we found in the analysis is that an increase in demand due to an increase in population would be much more difficult to cope with for the water supply system than climate change. So I'm going to stop here and I welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Julie. It's very insightful and very interesting to learn about this topic of decision making under uncertainty. At the moment, there haven't been any questions submitted. Now, just to speak to all of the attendees, we are running slightly over, but the panelists will be available at the end, and Julie, I think it will be okay if you can stay on the line, and we may go back to panelists for questions after we've gone through the final two panelists. We should just be a few minutes over, but I'll keep an eye out for questions for Julie. But thanks again for joining. And yes, and we'll go to questions later. So I'm going to move forward. Just bear with me 1 second. So I'm going to introduce the next speaker, who is Craig Davies. Craig is the Senior Manager for Climate Change Adaptation at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the EBRD. Craig leads EBRD's work to promote climate resilience through investment operations in Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the Caucasus, Turkey, and the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean. He's got a particular interest in climate change impacts on emerging economies and in the integration of climate resilience investment planning across a range of sectors such as infrastructure, water, power and energy, manufacturing and financial services. He is also actively involved in a number of international climate finance mechanisms such as the Climate Investment Funds and the Global Environment Facility. So today, Craig is going, just bear with me a second. Sorry, just a slight technical hitch there. Sorry, yeah, Craig's going to speak to us about EBRD's experience of integrating climate resilience into hydropower investments in Tajikistan and Morocco, entailing physical upgrades and technical partnerships on climate risk management with hydrometeorological services and OECD hydropower operators. So I'm going to bring Craig online now. So hello, Craig. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Alex. Thanks for the introduction. Can I just check that everyone can hear me? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you clearly. There's no comments in the chat that there are any problems, so please do go ahead.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm aware that we're running over time, so I will try to be very, very brief. And I'd like to thank the other three speakers for some very informative presentations. And I will try to give a very brief presentation. I don't have slides, which is an incentive for me to be even more brief. So as Alex explained, EBRD has been working in this space of climate resilience in hydropower over the last number of years, and I'd like to talk to you primarily about our work in Tajikistan, where we've done quite a bit of work in this area. Tajikistan, for those of you who don't know, is a country in Central Asia with a very high dependency on hydropower. About 98% of the electricity generated in the country is generated by hydropower. It's a country with a lot of important development challenges. It's a low-income country, and it's a country that has suffered a great deal of disruption to its economy over the last 20 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the challenge of ensuring that the population has access to reliable and affordable electricity is a top priority for the country. but it's also one of the most climate vulnerable countries in indeed the whole EBRE region. It's a country that depends upon a very glacial hydrology, and it depends upon that glacial hydrology for not just power generation but also all the other important productive economic sectors, for example agriculture, which is heavily dependent on irrigation. And it's a country, I think as the last speaker Julie pointed out, that climate change is often a risk amplifier as opposed to being a discrete risk in its own right. And certainly in the case of the Tajik energy sector, there are many other risks and challenges, such as the fact that the infrastructure is pretty old. Most of the hydropower facilities and indeed the transmission network were built during the Soviet years. So for example, dams go back to even in some cases the 1940s, 1950s. They've reached the end of their productive life in many cases, and there is an urgent need for rehabilitation and modernization. And then of course on top of that picture of weak aging infrastructure, aging almost in some cases obsolete equipment, climate change then with the prospect of increasing variability poses an even more acute threat. So why did we look at Tajikistan in the first place? Well, firstly for the reasons I've described, but additionally because there was an opportunity in Tajikistan to work with the climate investment funds through their pilot program for climate resilience, called the PPCR for short. And thanks to the PPCR, we were able to access grant resources to do a great deal of upfront work in this sector. And what we tried to do through that upfront work was to really understand the context of climate variability and climate change for the Tajik hydropower sector, to try to understand what does this mean for the hydrological conditions under which these facilities will be operating. So what we tried to do during that period is that we tried to understand what is the envelope of uncertainty in terms of hydrological conditions, in terms of the inflows to a particular dam linked to a particular hydropower facility, which is the Karakum hydropower facility, which is on the Sird Darya River. And we tried to understand what is the envelope of uncertainty in terms of how we think that the inflows into that dam might vary over the next half a century. And again, Julie is absolutely spot on with her very effective visualization of the cascade of uncertainty that we have, and as Julie explained, there is layer upon layer of uncertainty, which just leads ultimately to a picture of a bewilderingly broad range of possible future climate scenarios. What we tried to understand in this effort in Tajikistan was what should we be using as the boundaries of the envelope of uncertainty over future hydrological conditions that we expect this dam and this hydropower facility to operate under over its expected lifespan. And again, I'm not going to go into the technical details, and without slides it's pretty hard to anyway, but I will say that we do have a detailed publication on our website regarding this Tajikistan case study. So if you simply Google EBRD Tajikistan hydropower, you'll find this case study which will explain things in much more detail and also with some helpful graphics. So what we tried to do is to, as I say, explore the full envelope of uncertainties and identify what is the envelope of projected future climatic and hydrological conditions under which the dam would have to operate. And then I think there are two approaches, two avenues of analysis that we went along. The first was, what should we do physically to this dam to give us a better chance of it being able to cope with the expected range of climatic and hydrological conditions over the 50-odd years to come, bearing in mind how we think climate change may act as a risk amplifier. And that was the first avenue of analysis, which was what should we do on the physical side. And again, I mean, I think Julie put it across very, very well. We have a real conundrum here because we have huge uncertainty over the future, and climate change is making that uncertainty even more difficult to put boundaries around. But we have to build these things now, and we have to renew them now. We don't have the luxury of being able to wait 20, 30, 40 years until we have, hopefully one day, better and more reliable climate models. We have to make these decisions now or the lights will go out in Tajikistan at least. So we have a difficult situation in which we have to make investment decisions about expensive, long-lived infrastructure in this context of high uncertainty. So the first line of questioning is, what can we do to ensure that we're making the best possible decisions we can with the limited information that we have at the moment? I thought it was noteworthy that in Tracy's presentation, one of the slides indicated that IHA members had flagged up cost-benefit analysis as a key issue, and if I remember correctly, it was seen as something that would be very useful for helping hydropower operators to make decisions. That's what we did. That's one of the tools that we used in this exercise in Tajikistan, where we came up with a representative range of hydroclimatic scenarios, which we held as being representative of this envelope of uncertainty that I'm talking about. And then we calculated the net present value, the economic net present value of a range of different technological options. Specifically, we were focusing on turbine selection across the range of those climate scenarios. And using a pretty basic min-max analysis, we then were able to get a handle on which of these technology options are likely to give us the best economic outcome in terms of net present value across a range, across the range of hydroclimatic scenarios that we held as being our envelope of uncertainty. Now, this is a pretty crude tool, and we're aware of that, and we hope that as in subsequent investments we'll be able to come up with more sophisticated tools. But I think it's interesting that we found that this measure of net present value was quite an interesting tool for helping us to understand what, and also very importantly, to communicate to our client. And our client in this case was Baki Tojik, which is the Tajik state power utility. So it was a very useful tool for us to be able to communicate to our client what these choices could entail, and how the different technology options might be expected to perform in the light of increasing uncertainty. So that was, in very brief terms, that was the first avenue, which was the question of what should we do in terms of the physical investment. However, just as previous speakers have said, there was a huge residual question of, but we still have huge uncertainty, and we still have poor data, and we have limited capacity to make use of climate data, hydrometeorological data. So alongside the physical upgrade issue came the second set of issues, which was what can we do to build the capacity of operators in the hydropower sector and other relevant agencies and authorities to manage this uncertainty better, to understand how to use and interpret climate models, to understand how better to use those tools and models in forecasting or management of hydropower utilities. Just to give you an example, in Tajikistan, the operating rules used by hydropower dam operators are very, very rigid, and in all cases, in fact, they're still using the operating rules that were put in place during the Soviet years back in the 1970s, which in turn were based on hydrological data collected during the 1950s and 1960s. Now, these operating rules are still used very, very rigidly in Tajik hydropower dams. They haven't been touched for decades, and this is the kind of issue that we have. It's an example of the kind of challenge we've got. How can we work with these hydropower dam operators to help them modernize and upgrade the kinds of decision-making tools that they're using? How can we form partnerships between, for example, the Tajik Hydromet Service and the Baki Tojik, for example, building capacity for climate diagnostics, climate risk forecasting, seasonal forecasting? How can we work with Baki Tojik to help them to update operating rules, to put in place dam management regimes that maximize energy production while minimizing spill and optimize dam safety? So the conclusion of this second line of work was to work with Barki Logic and indeed other Tajik agencies such as Tajik Hydromet to provide a very comprehensive package of technical support. And that support is about to start in the new year, in January. And as part of that support, we have appointed a consortium that includes representatives from Hydro-Quebec in Canada, which I know is an IHA member. And we think that this is a very important part of the process here, which is the concept of twinning hydropower operators in developing countries with hydropower operators in developed countries to try to facilitate and foster a kind of peer-to-peer learning from countries, and I think Canada and particularly Quebec is a country where there has been a lot of work on understanding climate risks to hydropower operations, to understand how other countries, less developed countries, but with similar challenges in terms of highly climate vulnerable hydropower sectors with, again, glacial hydrology, how lessons can be learned and understanding and best practice can be shared between such countries. So I think I'll stop talking about Tajikistan there. As I said, we have a number of publications on our website if anybody would like to look them up or simply email me and I could happily point you towards them. I'll just finish by saying that we are also working in Morocco and where we've tried to replicate the Tajikistan approach, working there with the ONE, which is the Office National d'Electricité and de l'Eau, I think, which is the national power, energy and water utility in Morocco. I will be going to Morocco the week after next for a technical workshop at which we'll be presenting the findings of the climate risk analysis that we've carried out in Morocco over the past 6 months in relation to the hydropower sector, and based on that workshop we'll then be beginning to design a further technical package of support to the Moroccan hydropower industry, which will hopefully replicate the approach that we've been able to take in Tajikistan. So I'll stop there because I know we really are well over time, but again I'm also happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that intervention, Craig. And we're actually, just to let everyone know who's participating in the webinar, we're actually going to be convening a webinar early next year, so probably in January, but we haven't got a date set, to look more closely at EBRD's activities in this area. We'll be sending out information to you very soon on how you can join that. So yeah, there'll be an opportunity in a few weeks' time to explore EBRD's activities further. I'm going to move on to the final speaker today. That's Richard Taylor. Richard is IHA's Chief Executive, to present the outcomes of the recent workshop, which I mentioned earlier, and common ways forward. Richard is a fellow of the Energy Institute in the UK. He's been involved in the hydropower sector since 1985. He's written and edited numerous technical papers and periodicals on water and energy. He's been engaged in United Nations initiatives on water, energy and climate change. So I'm just going to bring Richard online now. So Richard, would you like to share with the participants what did we get out of the workshop that was co-hosted between IHA and the World Bank earlier this month?
Yeah, thank you. I think that we've had a very good overview from Pravin, Julie, and Trace's summary, as well as the last presentation, which is really showing that we're having to report around climate change provision. We've been very much looking at resilience through this workshop through a climate lens, but do recognise it's superimposing itself on existing risk management practice, and recognising that there are other dynamics that we're having to cope with in terms of operations and market, that this adds further uncertainty and complexity, and often, as Julie mentioned, it's very context specific. So what we're really pleased to have achieved through the workshop is the fact that we were able to get the survey, and there's a sort of further learning from the survey, and we will answer the questions that have been raised. I think for me, out of the survey, the recognition of change is also brings opportunities as well as threats, and there is a real need to build capacity, as Craig just mentioned, the example of coupling with those that have perhaps got more capacity or done more work in this area with those that have got less capacity or have done less. So that was good. I think I should mention the fact that we had several members that contributed to the workshop. I very much appreciate Mott MacDonald's support in getting the survey together, and that was very helpful in participating in the workshop. We also had input from NG, talking about the kind of challenges that increased climate variability are already bringing. The case of Jirau on the Madeira River in Brazil, where just at the point of nearing completion of that project, it experienced a 300-year flood, with the month of February 2014 exceeding historical maximum records by 100%. So an extremely dramatic event that caused a lot of issues at that site, but at the same time recognizing that actually some of those impacts would have actually been worse had the project not been there, not least because of the flood attenuation, but also because of the infrastructure around it. There was a better capacity to deal with an emergency in the region as a result of some of the developments that was associated with the hydro development. We also had an input from Landsverken in Iceland, which was very much looking at how to factor in climate change. There's already trending and evidence to show that the glacial melt in Iceland is expected to be continuing, but at a rate of where the glacial feed for the system is expected to be around for at least another 200 years. So as not to get things out of proportion, the impact there in the system is that there will be more runoff, looking at the boundaries of the scenarios that have a upper bound and a lower bound, and trying to sort of look at a medium way through as well, making decisions on new projects and planning. And indeed the capacity, the planting of the particular equipment design, spillway design, etc., being influenced by that and very much incorporated into the planning mode. Also, we had a contribution from Hydro-Québec, which I think was showing largely a great deal of effort and work with the academic world in terms of trying to understand what the future might bring from the point of view of impacts on generation, impacts of extreme events that go beyond the obvious, to some increased events that don't necessarily relate to precipitation, but very strong winds, very, very cold periods, the impacts on the linear infrastructure as well as the power station, and also the impacts on the demand from the market impacts of changing temperatures and how that would bring about a new market and regime in the future. And again, we're working within boundaries and confidences that are quite broad. Examples of how we might cope with that were brought forwards by the University of Manchester, which tried to demonstrate how we will have to work with multiple objectives and the trade-offs between those objectives. A six-dimensional analysis was shown, taking into consideration the reliability of delivering the service, the supply, the capital costs of various actions, the energy impacts, and trying to grasp somehow the resilience of these different trade-offs to find an optimum solution that we could be able to see being successful through a breadth of potential changes in the future. So I think I should like to take this opportunity to thank all of those inputs. I think basically at the end of the day we're looking to try and not just look at the risks, but to measure resilience and to find consensus around how resilience should be measured, define good practice around that, and improve our own tools about performance in the hydropower sector, particularly building that into our sustainability assessment work that would allow for this increased focus and of attention into reporting around hydropower operations and the sustainability performance of those in going forwards. So that's my summary. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Richard. And just before we move on to some very brief closing comments from each of the panelists, would you like to just say a couple of words about what the next steps for IHA are?
Yeah, we talked about working with the leading organisations, or organisations that are showing leadership in this. I think it's demonstrated very clearly that both the World Bank and World Bank Group and EBRD. I should have mentioned also that IFC gave a very interesting presentation on blended finance, which was to ensure that, or to try and encourage and stimulate that these challenges are being met by the private sector. We need to ensure and have a better understanding that these services that ultimately could be incorporated to manage better extreme events, not least flood control and drought protection, how can we create an understanding and incentivize these aspects to be built into future projects that are largely going to fall within the private sector. So I think that's something that we would want to be working more on, to understand how we can provide better understanding and motivation for climate to be reported around, so that we can be confident that the right kinds of decisions are being taken. We got into some detail earlier about the mitigation. I shouldn't say that because of the complexity, but the building in of resilience or reducing risks. For example, equipping a hydropower station with turbines that will operate at a reasonable level of efficiency over an increased range of head. Spillway capacities, spillway equipment, gating, and what types of gates that might be used on spillways to make sure that we can handle more extreme events, but also potentially take advantage of increased storage that might be making the plant more flexible in its operating modes. So we've got a lot to do. The next step, immediate next step, as you mentioned, will be the next webinar in the series. We'll also be putting out the report from the workshop, and looking very much forward to working with our partners in improving the understanding in this area. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's certainly a very useful summary of where we are now and what the next steps will be. So we're very close to wrapping up now. Thank you again for everyone who's attended. I'm just going to do a quick circulation round each of the panelists and just give everyone an opportunity to make some final closing comments. I'm going to go to Pravin first. Pravin, would you like to briefly summarize and make some closing remarks?
Thank you, Alex. I'd just like to say how important this whole work on resilience in the hydropower sector is to the World Bank Group. Our management is very committed to increase the share of the funding that goes to climate finance, and amongst the various pillars that define the work of the World Bank Group, climate change and resilience is going to be at the forefront. Basically, we see that the climate change lens actually provides us an opportunity to visit the old problems in water and energy management. It's a segue into better management. So, for example, old issues like sediment management, we suddenly get an opportunity and interest to revisit, and we've been doing that in our client countries from Tajikistan to Pakistan to South America and Africa. So these age-old problems are being revisited, and hopefully we'll be able to do a better job. I'd like to emphasize again the need to train consultants, need to have a more common platform. The climate change science can't be a black box to engineers anymore. There's a better way to explain how to use the science to develop the methodology, so they can better design their spillways and dams and tunnels. So that engineering interface is absolutely necessary. Moving forward, we have a very big dedicated team at the World Bank Group, comprising economists, engineers, scientists. So we will be working on this issue going forward, where we will be organizing an event on climate change and resilience in the new year, inviting all the lending agencies to disseminate the work we've been doing, especially on decision making under uncertainty and the decision tree method that we are trying to adopt. So hopefully we will invite IHA as well. And we will continue talking at different platforms and fora around the world. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Pravin, for that summary and closing comments. I'm going to ask Julie now. Julie, do you have any final comments before we close? Very sorry, I think Julie might not be on the line.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Sorry, Julie, yes, you're there.
No, I'm here. I was muted for some reason. No, I'm sorry, I don't have any final comments to make. I think this was very interesting. I really enjoyed listening to everyone.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm aware that Craig has had to move on to other commitments. I'm aware that someone did have a direct question for Craig about some of the findings from the Moroccan hydropower risk analysis. We will follow up on this for you, and it's possible that this will be covered in more detail as well when we convene the webinar on EBRD's work in this area. But Jim, thank you for that question. We will follow up on that and see if we can get back to you with an answer afterwards. So all that remains for me now is to once again thank our panel of expert speakers. I want to extend my thanks again to everyone who responded to our survey. Your input has been extremely valuable to this initiative, and everyone who participated and presented in our recent workshop on the topic. We're going to be sending out a survey after the webinar, just very brief, only 4 questions to ask you what your experience has been like today. It's we're looking to host a lot more of these webinars to build and share knowledge on various hydropower topics, so we want to make sure that they're as good as they possibly can be. And if you have any comments, that will certainly help to shape the way that we host these webinars in future. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join, and we'll see you again soon at another webinar. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, attendees.